With recent releases like The Rings of Power and The Witcher Blood Origin, there's been a resurrection of the old debate about the nature of adaptation. What changes are acceptable in adapting a work from one medium to another? How faithful must an adaptation be to the source material in order to be considered true or even great? It is a debate that has become increasingly charged in recent decades as more pop culture is drawn from existing properties. These arguments about textual fidelity are very common. They allow the person making them to position their criticism as an argument from authority. After all, it isn't simply that the person in question doesn't like a given narrative or character choice, it's that the choice itself is wrong. Indeed, it's possible to frame the debate in overtly emotional or moral terms. The change is a betrayal of the source material. It is proof that the people making the adaptation don't care about the work itself. It's a very comforting approach to criticism. It even has a whiff of objectivity about it that appeals to people who argue about media online. It's like quoting a Rotten Tomatoes score, a number that tells you how good a movie is or isn't. A difference between one version of a story and an adaptation of that story isn't just a matter of taste, it is an objectively verifiable fact. The unspoken assumption that the difference must be bad is a matter of taste, but that often sneaks by into the subtext of the argument. It saves the hassle of actually engaging in discussion. Now, to be clear, The Witcher Blood Origin is bad. It's very bad. Even before it starts ripping off The Godfather Part 3. It also makes fairly substantive deviations from the established lore. These deviations themselves might be bad, but they are not bad because they are deviations. They're bad because they are poorly written, poorly judged, and occur in a narrative that was weak enough to begin with, even before it was hacked to pieces in the editing booth. The fact that Blood Origin is different from the source material is incidental. It would still be bad, even if it was faithful. However, unpacking all of that takes effort. It also involves some measure of subjectivity. There may well be people out there who greatly enjoy Blood Origin, and who can make compelling arguments for their preference.
We don't know. Frankly, we don't want to know.
Their criteria for evaluating a work may be different. The argument that it is inherently bad because it is different serves to sidestep these potential arguments. It is a trump card that can be played at any moment in time, overriding the debate and arriving at a neat conclusion. Of course, any attempt to pull back and zoom out will reveal how arbitrary this criticism can be, and how it is often a mask for the preferences of the person making it. The Rings of Power is a useful case study here, given the number of complaints that it generated over its supposed betrayal of the source material. In particular, there's been a vocal strain of criticism concerning the show's treatment of Galadriel as something akin to an action heroine. The Rings of Power invites comparisons to Peter Jackson's adaptation of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. The production design evokes the movies. The decision to shoot at least the first season in New Zealand ensured some continuity between the titles. Howard Shore, the composer for Jackson's movies, wrote the title theme, and series composer Bear McCreary has talked about wanting to, quote, honor the legacy of what Howard Shore created. There were even early talks about Jackson himself being involved in the show. There's some suggestion that the Tolkien estate vetoed Jackson's involvement with the series. If so, it seems that their long-stated distaste for his adaptations may have been a factor. Christopher Tolkien famously claimed that Jackson had, quote, eviscerated the book by making it an action movie for young people aged 15 to 25. If Peter Jackson's film adaptations weren't faithful enough to impress the son of J.R.R. Tolkien, then perhaps textual fidelity isn't the ultimate arbiter of a work's quality. Christopher Tolkien was not alone in accusing Jackson of altering the source material for the worse. Look, I understand the movies are not books, that the pace requirements are different, and what's suspenseful on the page may not be suspenseful on the screen, acknowledged Katie Nephew writing at Tor.com. But was it really necessary to create suspense through making so many characters self-centered, short-sighted, and ill-informed? By, in other words, diminishing them. There remains a tension within Lord of the Rings fandom between book fans and film fans. In many cases, the changes that book fans hate are the choices that film fans love. Most obviously, some book fans are very vocal in their objections to the changes that Jackson made to the character of Faramir in The Two Towers, even labeling him far from the Bookemir, although personally I prefer Subparamir. However, film fans consider Faramir to be one of the most compelling members of the franchise's ensemble. Indeed, some criticisms of The Rings of Power have very specific echoes in early objections to Jackson's Lord of the Rings. Book purists were, and I quote here, furious that Jackson had expanded the role of Arwen to involve a horse chase in the Fellowship of the Rings. There were criticisms that Arwen had been turned into, and I quote here, an action heroine. In some ways, the fan reaction to the Lord of the Rings trilogy foreshadowed so much of what pop culture would become. As others have noted, particularly Salon.com in their review of the expanded edition, there was a sense that Jackson and his collaborators were, quote, nearing the end of their polite tolerance of the meddlesome, scolding side of Tolkien fandom, unquote, by the time that they were working on The Two Towers. Now, history appears to have vindicated the production team. Regardless of the changes that they made to the source material, the Lord of the Rings trilogy remains a singular accomplishment in popular cinema. It was an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings as only Jackson could have made it. There are more extreme examples of the liberties talented creators can take with source material. In 2006, for example, Michael Mann reimagined Miami Vice for the 21st century. It was an extremely loose adaptation of the episode Smuggler's Blues, which perhaps makes it the first big-budget blockbuster to be based on an episode of television that was itself based on a Glenn Frey song. I'm not kidding there. However, the film casts aside much of the iconic look and texture of the classic series. Very little of the movie even took place in Miami. The movie was divisive when released, but has been reclaimed in some quarters as a masterpiece. When Phil Lord and Christopher Miller made a cinematic adaptation of the 1980s television show 21 Jump Street, they reframed the high-concept police procedural as a self-aware spoof. Although the show had been successful enough to be the first hit on the young Fox network, there was minimal outrage over it. Lord and Miller's adaptation was a comedic highlight of the 2010s, and a movie successful enough to spawn an even more self-aware sequel in 22 Jump Street. Again, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to adaptation. When Dax Shepard adopted a similarly irreverent approach to his big screen take on the 1970s motorcycle cop show Chips, the results were catastrophic. However, Chips wasn't bad because Shepard hadn't shown suitable reverence to the source material, any more than 21 Jump Street was good because Lord and Miller had embraced irreverence. Chips was simply a bad movie. It was unfunny, uninspired, and unbearable. In this context, it's worth briefly considering The Last of Us, the adaptation of the Naughty Dog video game that is currently screening on HBO. The show has been very faithful to the video game, even involving the game's co-director Neil Druckmann. There are plenty of mythology gags and references, lines of dialogue are quoted verbatim. Scenes are recreated in live action almost perfectly.
Light on the reading, but it has some interesting pictures.
Oh, no.
However, the show's masterpiece is its third episode, one that deviates dramatically from the source material, detailing the love affair between Bill and Frank. This was a relationship that could never be depicted in the video game, owing to the constraints of that particular medium. In the game, the player has to pick up notes and inferences to decode the relationship that existed between Bill and Frank long before they passed through this space. On a television show, the creative team have the freedom to tell that story in a more interesting, more direct, and more involving way. The result is a masterpiece of television, one of the best episodes of television in quite a while. That episode didn't work because it was overly faithful to the source material, it worked because it was a good adaptation of the source material. It was willing to make changes where they needed to be made, to tell its own story, to use the elements of the source material in interesting ways that spoke to the medium in which it was being adapted. Faithfulness to source material is not an objective signifier of quality. If it was, Gus Van Sant's shot-for-shot remake of Psycho would be regarded as a masterpiece for the care with which it recreates Alfred Hitchcock's original. After all, the biggest difference between the two is that one is shot in color and the other in black and white, and that one features a scene of Vince Vaughn masturbating. I saw it, so you have to too. The movie was a critical and commercial flop. Van Sant's Psycho is perhaps most interesting as a piece of experimental art, and is perhaps best experienced as Steven Soderbergh's mashup of the two films as Psychos, and you can watch that entire film on his website. In some ways, Van Sant's Psycho is a quietly influential film. Its legacy lives on in these debates that praise faithfulness as an unambiguous virtue, but more directly in the slate of Disney's quote-unquote live-action adaptations of their classic cartoons, like The Lion King or Aladdin, which are often slavish in everything from the soundtrack to the dialogue to shot composition. There's no acknowledgement made of the differences between animation and live action, or the effects emulating live action. There's no suggestion that a cartoon is different from a live action film, that an animated lion can articulate its emotions better than a seemingly real one. Adaptation is an art form like any other. Film, television, books, and video games are all different forms of media. They all work in different ways. What works in one will not necessarily work in the other, and there is no objective metric to measure the quality of an adaptation in one form to its source material in another. In many cases, the quality of the adaptation is largely independent of the quality of the object that inspired it. Steven Spielberg's Jaws is very different from Peter Benchley's Jaws. It's arguably better. Francis Ford Coppola's The Godfather is different from Mario Puzo's The Godfather, even though Puzo worked on the screenplay. Those adaptations are widely considered to be better than their source material, in large part due to the changes that they made to it. The Rings of Power and Blood Origin are both shows with fairly significant problems. Copying and pasting lines of text directly from the source material will not fix the obsession that the Rings of Power has with mystery boxes, and will not make Blood Origin's dialogue, characterization, or editing any better. It's a distraction from the real problems, and often a way of cutting off more interesting conversations about art. It doesn't matter how faithful an adaptation is, simply how good. I've been Darren Mooney, and this was In the Frame.